Ooh, okay. Hey, look at that. How's it going, everybody? I'm uh, I'm Dan LaChance. I'm going to be talking about some election security today. Yeah. So, who am I? I'm a second-year cybersecurity major with a CE minor. I'm the wireless IG lead, so please go to that. It's a lot of fun. We're going to be hacking some drones this semester, so show up for that. I'm your tech lead. I did some research at the Yukon Voter Lab, and I'm an avid skier and rock climber. Fun stuff. I'm working at Microsoft. Yeah. Okay. So this talk is kind of like an extension of a ShmooCon talk that I really liked. So it was done by this guy, Matt Blaze, who's a professor and researcher at Georgetown University. So his was on how to make elections more trustworthy and in a world of untrustworthiness, right? So that was pretty cool. But I felt like I could have gone more in depth into it. I mean, we're all pretty technical people, so I think we can understand fairly technical and statistically technical topics. So I thought, why not make a talk that was going a little bit more in depth than that? So, quick background review of his talk. Because it did have some really, really good things in it. So one of the best things one of the best slides I'd say he had was these two truths in voting security. So for one, electronic election systems are inherently vulnerable, and there has been no really good way of fixing them. And I'll get into the reasons behind like why we can't really secure them all that much in a minute. But the other thing is that there's been honestly no credible evidence that any of these vulnerabilities have ever been exploited. So there's really not too much to worry about. And even if they did get exploited, I'll get into why that also doesn't really matter. And that's through a system of audits. Yeah. So there are easier ways. This is another reason why they haven't been exploited that much. Like the easiest way to influence an election is to just sway public opinion on social media. Like I know we all saw that TikTok is getting banned. This is one of those reasons. Yeah. So why are elections vulnerable? They got to fulfill all of these all of these requirements. It's a lot. There's a lot of restrictions on like what you can and can't do with elections. You need to ensure voting privacy, voter authentication, ensure ballot secrecy, so you can't know who each person votes for just by looking them up. It has to be auditable, and I'll get into that at the end of the talk. But then there also needs to be end-to-end verification. Verifiability. That's the word that I put there. So it needs to be cast as intended, counted as intended, and then tallied as collected. All of those things super important to ensure fair elections. Yeah. So if you don't know, who comes from? Actually, I have a slide on this. Look at this map. Who comes from a state that is in red or yellow? Yeah. So have you all voted? Have you done like the electronic voting systems before? Yeah. You haven't, Asa? Mail-in? Okay, yeah. So it's either mail-in or that. Mail-in is obviously going to be paper. You're not going to just like go onto some website and then say, oh, this is who I want to vote for. That's not a very good idea. So all of those states, according to the MIT Research Lab, pretty credible. They all have at least some sort of electronic ballot marking devices or tabulators. Ooh, yeah. And then the other states don't. Was that you? Okay, so yeah. Then, so these are all the voting manufacturers. There's really a lot of them. There's actually only one that really matters. There's only one that's generally in the public eye. Yeah, well, it's by county that they decide on who to buy. Um, oh, that's another thing from Matt Blaze's talk. The way that it's all like all of elections are handled is at the county or even town level. It's not even state, not federally sanctioned. So all of that, well, it is federally sanctioned because they get funding, but it's not enforced by the federal government. It's enforced by the counties and run by them. So that means that the like voting centers are competing for the budget of like with like the school board and all of those other necessities for smaller towns. So generally voting centers are underfunded and rely heavily on volunteer help. So yeah. Yeah, so Dominion, which is, can you see my mouse? Oh yeah, this one right here. It is far and away the largest one. So 92% of voting machines in circulation as of 2017. That's just like the most recent number that I could find. And I was, when I did my research at the Yukon Voter Lab, I was fortunate enough to get my hands on a few Dominion voting machines, and I got to test around with like some auditing and see. Even though Connecticut didn't use these voting machines, I could see how like an attacker could break into one of them. But in general, they like I said before, there hasn't been any credible evidence. So Dominion holds up pretty well whenever, because they get hit with a ton of lawsuits all the time. Yeah, I mean, if you keep up with news, I'm sure you know that. So, but they hold up in court every time, and even in like defamation lawsuits, they always win, just because even though they have some vulnerabilities, they're generally pretty sound, and auditing makes it so that a defamation case is definitely in their favor. Yeah, so the voting process, so there's a few things, a few moving parts. There's the ImageCast X, which is like the leading uh, it's the leading ballot marking device. So this is what the user is going to interact with. So they're going to like mark who they want to vote for, and then it prints out this sheet, generally has a QR code on it. And I did some research with the QR code. So I did a talk on that recently, and I might make a blog post about it. So be on the lookout for that. It's pretty cool stuff. That's actually what I did at UConn. So yeah, then that gets fed into the tabulator. The tabulator reads the QR code and then adds it to a database externally, and that's where all of the votes are tallied. And again, this is only if you're in a county that does electronic voting. So like all of Connecticut doesn't do any, which is where I'm from. Yeah, and so one of the key things in this though is that it establishes a clear paper trail. This is probably the most important piece in this entire thing, because worst case scenario, if all of the other stuff goes down and you still have the paper ballots that got printed, it's still completely like a completely valid election. And these ballots, the paper ballots, are what eventually gets audited. Yeah. So some fun vulnerabilities. It's kind of, a few of these are pretty cool. So I found this article on ImageCastX. It has a bunch of issues. I'm going to highlight 4 of them. The article outlined 9, so I have it linked in the resources at the end if you're interested in going and reading them. But this was around 2022, just pretty much the most recent one that I could do. So I'll get into that. And also, a lot of these machines are running like Windows 7, old Android, and so for a while until Windows 7 went end of support, they were like actually paying extra. Like Dominion was paying extra to Microsoft to continue to update Windows 7, but that got wiped out in 2023. So I haven't looked too much into what they're doing now, but I imagine most of them are getting upgraded to Windows 10 because it is kind of a necessity at this point. Yeah, and so another issue that I found is that they're also reliant on no longer existing companies' infrastructure, which is probably not the best. But again, underfunded organizations, that's naturally going to happen. All right, so the first one, this one's kind of cool. So mutable attestation or measurement reporting data. So pretty much here, the voting device implements a secure boot and stores the hash for reporting purposes. Really, what you can do is you can just the attacker can change the hash that is getting reported, and so it makes audits definitely somewhat harder, and because it breaks the integrity of like your reporting. So I mean, I don't really have to explain why that's an issue to all of you. I'm sure you know. Yeah. So it could allow an attacker to cover his or her tracks. That's really all this would actually be good for. But yeah, so this is just like a cover-up operation. The next ones are a little bit higher, a little bit more of an issue. So for some reason, undocumented and generally inaccessible functionality has been discovered in the source code for these things. Not entirely sure why. I couldn't find a clear answer to it, but there have only been like 2 cases where it's actually been malicious. It actually had malicious functionality. And so one of those was CVE 2022, which has been patched. I just thought this one was pretty cool because I like wireless stuff a lot. So whenever Wi-Fi is enabled, and I'll get into like the guidelines. That's what like one of my last slides. But basically, there's voluntary voting guidelines that I don't know why they call it like voluntary, because any government sanctioned voting location is required to follow them. So it's kind of silly to throw the voluntary on there. But I digress. In there, it says that Wi-Fi and Ethernet connection has to be turned off on these voting machines, since it's effectively just a printer. So you're typing stuff in, and then it prints out that ballot, and then you put the ballot into the tabulator box. So it does all of that. But if Wi-Fi was enabled under this vulnerability, you could get hard-coded credentials would give you an admin shell. And the issue with that is the credentials would reset to default on every boot. So you would just have to figure out a way to like turn off the machine and then get it back up, and then it has admin credentials, which, you know, kind of cool that someone figured that out, but also good that it's patched now. So next one, improper protection of alternate path. The voting device does not sufficiently protect every path to sensitive data, allows an attacker to reboot Android safe mode. And if you know anything about Android safe mode, it means that you can access the underlying operating system. So you can do some pretty interesting stuff with that, like, I don't know, get cryptographic keys, change data, logs, that kind of thing. So that one's not great. Next one, authentication bypass by spoofing. So there's an authentication mechanism that's vulnerable to forgery. This is the code right here. Well, this is kind of like pseudocode, because I don't think it's actually written in Java. Because I don't think this one is Android. I think that this was found on a Windows machine. So there is the Java code right there, and basically it authenticates using an IP address. So all you would need to do is spoof the IP address that it's looking for, and then you would be able to authenticate yourself as an administrator. Yeah. All right, so some note on these vulnerabilities. I know they sound really scary, but most of them are patched, and there's no credible evidence that they've actually been used. And this is just for the ImageCast X. And since it's Dominion, since it's 92% widely accessible to people, it's generally going to get more scrutiny than all of those other companies. So a lot of these vulnerabilities generally wouldn't be found otherwise. But yeah, some similar conclusions, could be drawn. All right, so audits. Why the vulnerabilities I just mentioned don't entirely matter. So audits are like a system that makes it so that even if somebody was able to break in to one of these electronic systems and change some data on there and change the database, the audits would be able to alleviate that and make it so that it doesn't really have any issue on the outcome of the election. So the purpose is to ensure what they call software independent voting systems. And that basically just means that you can do all of your audits and not have to worry about vulnerable software. So you can have complete faith, or you can have no faith in the software and still have complete faith that the correct winner of the election was chosen. Yeah, and so this is taken from a video. These two pictures are taken from a video of from the Yukon Voter Lab with the professor that I did my research with. So that was pretty cool. I got to see the 2022 election audits in action, which is pretty cool. All right, so risk limiting audits. This is another one of the things that Matt Blaze talked about that I don't think he really went in depth because it's actually pretty interesting. So this is a type of audit. Actually, I didn't add a slide on this. Does everybody know what like an audit is? No? Okay. So basically an audit, you take a random sample of the wider, all of the ballots and make sure that what they wrote down matched what was recorded in the database. And if you take, a statistically significant sample, and that you can draw conclusions for the rest of the population. And so if everybody that you sample, say you sample 10% of the voting population, and every single person, it was the exact same between the database and what they actually wrote on their ballot, then you have a very, very good, if it's chosen randomly, you have a very good indication that the election was correct. Do you have a hand up, Will? Oh, okay, my bad. Okay, so this was presented in 2008. It's the first statewide implementation in Colorado in 2017. So fairly recent technology. I mean, that was like 8 years ago now, but 2017 is still fairly recent in terms of audits. Okay, so how risk limiting audits actually work. So they use a key feature called natural escalation, which is just a fancy way of saying if you can't reject the null hypothesis, then do it again. So you take a sample, and like I said, 10% would be a good example. And if every person's vote matched on the database and what they wrote down, then you can reject the null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis there would be that, hey, we don't have enough evidence to say that, what's the word for it? That we don't have enough evidence to prove that election interference didn't change the outcome of the election. Yeah, so naturally, the wider the original margin, so say a state is decided by like 30%, like what one candidate gets like 65% of the population, the other candidate gets 35. You're going to need a much smaller audit for that to reject the null hypothesis, because it's a lot less likely that they were able to make up a 30% difference. Yeah. All right, so this is the full procedure. It's just like pseudocode. So pseudocode jargon, I would say. It's just like a loop saying that if you can reject the null hypothesis, good, you're done. If you can't, just keep going until you end up doing like a full-scale recount, which is what some states, like Georgia in recent years, have had to make it all the way to. Yeah. So the effectiveness, I found another article on the effectiveness of these audit measures. Three of them were put to the test. So risk limiting audits, they called EIs, election integrity audits, pretty much the same thing in this case. Then ballot polling, Bravo is what they call it, spot the difference, STD. Those three, pretty much it found conclusively that election integrity audits were like way more effective than normal metrics, so like 600% more effective. Even though this was a small study, it still holds some weight because of the conclusions it drew. Like 600% is just a crazy amount, 6 times more effective in deciding like close margins. And that means that they had to use like a small proportion that of the ballots in an audit than the other two had to. Yeah. So, if you're interested, I had that graph before of which countries do, uh, like, I had that map of the US of electronic polling, and this is the ones that use risk limiting audits. So, like I said, Colorado before, Georgia was that's another big one. And you'll notice it's what's good about this is it's definitely some battleground states like Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Michigan. I'm pretty sure we're like all switched within the last 3 elections. So it's definitely good that all of those places have risk limiting audits. So we have some very clear indication that the right winner of the election was chosen with, not spending millions and millions of dollars. Yeah. Okay, so like I mentioned before, not really sure why the VVSG is called voluntary, since any federally sanctioned election location has to follow it. But there's some cool stuff in here. If you want to read it, I have it linked at the end. I doubt any of you will. It's really boring. I wouldn't recommend it unless you're super interested. Some tidbits, though, it outlines good security posture. And one thing that I thought was really funny is that malware protection mechanisms are not required for voter-facing scanners like ballot marking devices. So the ImageCast X that I mentioned before falls under that category. So yeah, don't get any ideas. Yeah, that's everything. Those are my sources. If you're interested, come talk to me or go check out my research on QR codes. Thank you. Any questions? You can clap. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah, Adam. I'm not. What election? Yeah, okay, bro. OB's vulnerabilities. Do a full risk assessment on OB. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think anybody has that time. Yeah, what's up, Kyle? As in, like, which part of this? The audits or the audits? They'll go to a full recount if they have to. They just pull federal funding if. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's how they call elections. Yeah. And then just this for, post-election audits, that same thing, that same idea is in place, just on a smaller scale. What? You could say takes. I took linear instead. Sorry. Any other questions?
I have a question, Dan.
Anybody but Will? James. Try to influence an election. See, I don't know if that's actually single people. I think the most that they've ever been able to do is ballot stuffing, and I'm not entirely sure what their punishments were, but on the only people that are actually able to make all of the vulnerability exploits worthwhile are foreign governments, that kind of thing. So, and again, there's no evidence for that, so there hasn't really been a precedent set so far. If I was the judge, I, life is crazy. It depends on how much of an impact did they have. No, it does not. Okay, that would be like 20 years. Okay, yeah. Anybody else have any other questions?